Hello and welcome to Penmanship, a podcast about Australian writing culture. I'm your host, Andrew McMillen, and my guest in episode 42 is Katharine Murphy. Having spent more than 2 decades as a member of the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery, Katharine has earned a reputation as one of the nation's sharpest political analysts. While based in Canberra, she has worked as a reporter for the Australian Financial Review, The Australian, and The Age, and more recently, she has been a part of Guardian Australia's team since the website launched in 2013. In addition to her daily reporting and editorial duties, Katharine also writes occasional long-form essays for the Melbourne-based literary journal Meanjin. In late August, I spoke with Katharine before a live audience at the Canberra Writers Festival, whose theme in 2017 was power, politics and passion. Our conversation at the festival touches on Katharine's approach to political reporting, which requires constant scepticism while avoiding cynicism as much as possible. How her mother's fiery passion for a Sydney Morning Herald columnist rubbed off on her at a young age. What she has observed about the cultural differences of working for 3 different media organisations in Fairfax, Corp and The Guardian. What she has learned about the mechanics and logistics of live blogging political news with little time for coffee or bathroom breaks. And how she came to write an intimate and moving essay about the joys and sorrows of raising her daughter. Introducing Katharine Murphy, political editor of Guardian Australia, live from the 2017 Canberra Writers Festival. Thank you for joining me, Katharine.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to start by asking you about an essay that you have in the latest edition of Meanjin Quarterly, which is called "The Political Life is No Life at All." Where did the idea for this one come from, and how did it take shape?
Well, this is a piece that I put a lot of thought into, and it's a piece that I'm very, very happy to talk about because I think it's... In Australia, we think and talk an awful lot about political dysfunction. It's kind of like a hobby we have to talk about politics not working and politics not delivering what we want it to. We've done that over the last 10 years or so, on and off, variously. But there's not a lot of interrogation as to the why. I don't, as a long-term political journalist and practitioner, I honestly do not believe at any time that the political class in Australia went to bed one night, woke up the next morning with a burning aspiration to screw things up. I really don't think that happened. I think the reasons why politics is not delivering in the way that people want and need it to deliver are genuinely multifactorial. And we tend to focus on the public manifestation of what's not working, but we don't go behind and look at what's going on and why things may not be sort of panning out in the way we wanted to. So obviously, as a political journalist, I live cheek by jowl with parliamentarians. I know them very well. I know something of their lives. I know something of the personal stresses that they face in the job. And this particular essay was an effort by me to get parliamentarians to narrate their own story. And I thought if I could get some voices in the story who would be genuinely honest about the life and the peculiarities of the life, particularly over the last 10 years, then they would be telling a story to the Australian public that the Australian public has not really heard before.
That's correct. I hadn't even really thought about the human element, I suppose. It's very easy to become a jaded sort of media consumer, and what are those people in Canberra doing? It seems like they're spinning their wheels a lot of the time. We forget the human factor, kind of like the anonymity that the internet can provide, and you can make sweeping comments about politicians and that they're all a bunch of whatevers. But this essay that you wrote really brought the human factor into play. Was it hard to get people to talk to you on the record for that?
Yeah, it was. Well, it's not so much that it was hard to get people to talk to me, but it was hard to convince them that I would treat their story with respect. I think the difficulty for parliamentarians, and one of the reasons they don't talk about this stuff, is because they fear being spurned by their peers. They fear being judged by the media and the public if they present their own human face to the community. They're quite scared about doing that and the consequences of doing that. And so I needed to sort of create a safe space where people could tell their stories, and that I would try and share that story in as unfiltered way as possible. Just let them, because this piece for me was the objective of it was to get them to narrate their own story rather than me interposing myself significantly in the essay. I wanted them to tell their own story, and it's conducted in a sort of style of exit interviews, because if you've got a workplace culture problem in a large corporation, that's what corporations do. They conduct exit interviews to try and work out why good people are leaving, and I thought that's a helpful organising idea to put in this piece as I was drafting, and as I put it out to people to get some feedback. This sort of organising idea became more important in the structure of the piece. So yeah, look, I knew the people I interviewed well at a personal level. I know Greg Combay very well. I know Mel Washer, the Liberal MP, very well, and I know Matt Jones, the staffer I speak to, very well. So I suppose they had a basic level of trust. They knew I wasn't a cowboy, but none of them were very happy about doing it. No.
Okay. Well, you begin near the top saying Greg Combay is speaking about the destructive effects of contemporary political culture, and you've pressed him to talk about it. And there are a few points throughout the essay where they give maybe a superficial kind of answer and you prod a bit deeper. Were these emotional interviews to conduct at some level, or were they pretty cut and dry?
Emotional is not quite the right word, although there is a different sort of trust dynamic in the interview, because it's not a stock standard political interview where you're sitting down in front of a politician and as a journalist you have an objective, right? I go in, I speak to a politician, I am likely to emerge with a story that says X, Y, or Z. It's quite transactional, and everybody knows the rules of that game in a funny sort of way. Where you're conducting an interview like this, where you try to get public figures into a private territory or into a personal territory, the rules of the game shift a little bit. So it wasn't emotional so much as I felt the need as the interviewer in that process to project, this is a safe conversation to have. I get where you're coming from. I want to tell this story in a way where the Australian public can understand it. This will be okay. I'm not generally reassuring in interviews with politicians. It's not generally my style, not generally what I do. And interviews by their definition, or political interviews, are very often conflict-based. It's just the sort of nature of what we do. But in these conversations, I was very reassuring. They were long interviews with all of these people. I think Greg's interview, I probably spoke to him for close to an hour. Mel Washer I would have spoken to for half an hour. Matt Jones I spoke to, I think, for an hour and a half. So they were quite long conversations, and where I thought they were reaching roadblocks, either trying to shut themselves down or me down, I would just prod them over the barrier, and all of them, I've read the piece subsequently, and obviously aren't running, screaming from the burning building. So I think we did okay.
Mel Washer was an interesting one to quote or to interview for the article, because he is a former GP himself.
Yeah.
And you write, interestingly, that throughout his political career, he would have fellow politicians coming to his office for blood tests, but
blood pressures.
Blood pressure
Me too.
checks.
He would collar me in the corridor a lot and say, "Murphy, you're looking peaky. Get in the office. Take your blood pressure." Yeah, he's a terrific guy. Really fantastic guy. Yeah, and had that kind of sense of not responsibility. That's a silly word, but he cared. He really did care, and he ministered to most of the parliament, including journalists.
Do you think, broadly speaking, we need more of those sort of health or medical-based figures in Parliament House? Because
can't hurt, right?
Right, because by interviewing Mel Washer, you kind of open up, or he opens up the idea of the health concerns, and Greg Combet himself had some health concerns which led to him leaving the Parliament. That's an interesting topic which is rarely discussed in public, I think, that this is a stressful career where you're not seeing your family for long stretches. I think Greg Combet said that in his final year in Parliament he averaged 2 days at home per month. So these people are taking big risks or big sacrifices in their personal life to help the rest of us, in theory.
Yeah, it's a really tough business. And again, I didn't write the piece as some sort of great big public apologia for politics, and I didn't write the piece to try and get everybody sort of having mass waves of sympathy for parliamentarians. They're well remunerated. They lead really interesting, busy, productive lives. I don't think we need to sit around and, sort of, have existential terrors about what we're putting our politicians through. I don't think we need to do that. I do think we need to be aware, though, that this is an enormously demanding job, that they are at home not very much, that there is... And that where the essay goes is that the normal demands of the life, which have always been there, and in fact, if you think of the early years of the Parliament when people had to commute from Western Australia before you could fly across, I mean, it's sort of like comparatively the life is probably easier now than it's ever been because people are more connected than there have ever been. But what's happened over the last 10 years is we've had this dreadful sort of toxic period of leadership instability. And Mal, I think, Greg's very interesting about that because he narrates his own experience of being a senior cabinet minister in the middle of an internal government civil war and what that felt like for him, the impact that had on him. And but Mal's insight, I don't know why this wasn't obvious to me. It's sort of embarrassing that it wasn't obvious to me, but he said, look, before the leadership wars kind of dug in on both sides of politics, politics is a conflict business. We're all tuned to that. We all like a scrap. We're all getting out amongst it all the time. But at the end of the day, you could retreat to the party room. You could go back to your respective caucus room and your party room, and there would be an element of safe space there, that would be a place of psychic retreat. And once the leadership struggles sort of broke out on both sides, the party room was no longer a safe space. And so these parliamentarians who are working in a high conflict, stressful, enormously demanding business with next to no personal privacy, away from their families, literally holding the future of the country in their hands, have no safe retreat in Canberra. And that's what's happened over the last 10 years. And Mal's diagnosis is basically if you put people in extremis for long periods of time, then it has a physiological effect. People get into fight or flight mode. And if you sustain themselves, you sustain an occupation in that level of extremis for that period of time, people get a little bit unhinged. And that's kind of what we're witnessing. And so again, in terms of the purpose of the piece, again, it wasn't for the pity party of woe is politics. This has a practical implication for all of us. If democracy gets to a point where the lifestyle is so punishing, the terrain is so punishing that it's no longer a safe space for a human being to occupy, then that has implications for the quality of representation. We will only get a particular type of personality who wants to get into politics. We will get a particular type of personality who lives for the spotlight, who lives for conflict, who is animated by conflict, and who has no need for the sort of respite and safe space that normal humans do. And then the consequential impacts for democracy unfurl before you. And so that was why I need to tell this story. And I need to get, however I can, through whatever means, people to focus on this, because this is a really big problem. And we need to talk about it honestly, and we need to try and create a space where politicians can talk about it honestly as well.
What sort of response did you see from politicians or even political staffers since it was published?
Massive.
Yeah.
Massive. I've never had, both from the public, funny little things. Meanjin's a wonderful publication for people who don't know about Meanjin. It's got a 75-year history. It's a journal that has always published Australian writers, poets, and as a young sort of arts literature student, all of the poets I loved were published in Meanjin, and I always had this secret desire to be published in Meanjin myself. When the poetry career didn't work out, I had to have politics basically published in Meanjin. Anyway, that's an aside, but Meanjin's a wonderful, flourishing space under its current editor, and when we put the essay up online, we actually broke the Meanjin server. And they had to buy in additional bandwidth to basically cope with the traffic once it went online. And so that's gratifying to me because that indicates that people in the public, it was penetrating slightly outside of politics, which was my intention. But you've asked me about the reaction of politicians. I've had the most amazing conversations with people since that essay was published. I mean, I've had many interesting conversations with people over the years, which is the foundation of the piece. But subsequently, I've heard the most amazing stories from people about what their perception is about the sort of culture inside their party rooms, what political staff are doing to sustain themselves in these jobs, the most extraordinary things people are doing to sustain themselves in these jobs because they feel a very acute sense of public service and public obligation.
Like what?
Well, it's difficult to... I'm just very concerned about people's privacy because you can't create a safe space for people to talk to you and then subsequently retail confidences. Sadly, I would love to tell you some of the stories, seriously, like they've been mind-boggling. And maybe I can convince those people over time to talk some more, and maybe this long-form piece can evolve into something more long-form. But at this point, I need to respect people's confidences. But yeah, no, like I know a lot of politicians, but obviously in a parliament with as many politicians as we have, even a journalist of my experience, there are people in parliament I've never spoken to, parliamentarians I've never spoken to, and some people who I'd never spoken to picked up the phone and said, "Thank you for writing that, can I tell you bleh?" And, out it all came. So it touched a nerve. Whether it'll make any difference, well, I don't know, but it certainly touched a nerve.
How did you go about writing it? It's a pretty long piece, maybe 5,000 words?
6,000, I think, in that final draft.
Did you, before you write something like that, do you sit down and outline where you want to start and end, or you just sit down and let it come out?
Mostly, because I've had such a lot of my journalistic practice has required so much writing so quickly. I think I've always written fairly quickly. If I'm not writing quickly, there's a problem, generally. It's generally there's something in the structure that's not right, or I haven't nailed the thesis of the piece. If it's not flowing, then generally that denotes a problem. I think it's sort of, as I spoke to the three protagonists, I saw this tragedy in three acts, basically, in my head. That was the piece. That's how the piece kind of spoke to me as a conceptual frame, and then it was a question of how you sort of measure and intersperse the voices so that it's not too fragmentary, so that you can sort of weave the common themes through it. And I inject in the piece a bit my own views about it, but not very much. Like I say, I wanted them to tell their story. And it came fairly easily. I tend to, in these long-form things, get down a draft fairly quickly, but then the process of refinement takes the time where you're just literally just twiddling buttons. You're kind of turning volume up, turning a little bit of volume down. And I have trusted people who I often seek guidance from, including one who's sitting in this room and won't appreciate being looked at. Who can guide me if I'm sort of hitting... I know if I'm hitting a roadblock. I don't always know how to get over the roadblock, but I know if I'm hitting it. But this piece had been strangely in my head for such a long time that when I found the voices, it wrote itself, really.
Mm-hmm. How big is that brain's trust, maybe, if I can call it that, of colleagues who you trust, whose opinion you value in terms of showing them a draft? Is that a very small circle, or is it...
It's a pretty small circle, not because that's not a reflection on my colleagues, but it's sort of a reflection on our busy lives, that it's an imposition to really say, mate, I've just written this 6,000 words, if you've got lazy 10 minutes, you can sit down and have a look at it. It's not really an option. I tend to... I've always been a person who has sought out other writers with distinct voices, narrative voices, and have sought their guidance throughout my career and have been very lucky to benefit from that. And also, it's not only writers, it's people who have been editors who have that tremendous skill as well, which is different to my skill. People who know how to make a piece sing, and Jonathan Green, who's the current editor of Meanjin, is one such person who is a very, very good editor of copy and can say, look, that sentence that's in the 6th par really works if it's in the 10th, but it doesn't work if it's in the 6th, let's move it. Yeah. And not everyone has that skill, but he certainly does. And I have a small bunch of people who I rely on for that sort of guidance.
Can I ask who is in the Katharine Murphy Brains Trust?
Well, he is going to die, he's going to run. My husband, Mark Davis, who has been a long-time journalist himself and journalistic editor, and even if I wasn't married to him, I would say the best editor I've ever worked with and for. So he is a marvellous in-house support for my work, and he's very tough on my work. He doesn't spare me, which I don't always appreciate, but I always benefit from, always have. So he is, without a doubt, the most important person who I turn to in everything that I write. Jonathan's a great friend and a great support. Michael Gordon, the wonderful political editor at The Age, is a person I worked with and for a very, very long time, has been quite influential in my work and style. More latterly, in terms of the colleagues I work with at The Guardian, Gabrielle Chan, who I work with very closely, is a wonderful, wonderful writer, and is always helpful if I really need her to read something or give me feedback. She always does. And then there's the sort of psychic gallery Brains Trust. Michelle Grattan and I this week had a funny crossover moment where I think we wrote pretty much the identical column. Mine was in a different style to hers, but our sort of broad thesis was pretty much the same. And when you work, Michelle basically I've worked with and for, firstly at the Financial Review when I was very young and just starting out in journalism. Michelle was coming back from the Canberra Times in a sort of columnist and feature writing role at the Fin Review, and sat across from me, literally the petition over from me. And had a bit of time on her hands at that point because she wasn't sort of doing the main political job, so put an enormous amount of time into me, and I benefited enormously from that relationship. And then I later worked for her at The Age when she was political editor. I was her number 2. So when it's funny, if someone teaches you how to analyse politics in quite a hands-on way, Michelle and I still do have those weird crossover moments where with no sort of corridor consultation, we'll find ourselves in similar territory. We often find ourselves in quite different territory, and sometimes we argue about the territory we're in, but it's funny, that brain training that some early influencers have.
There's a quote from a Labor Party political staffer called Matt Jose, who worked for the ALP for 18 years, who Katharine quotes in her Meanjin essay. He says, being in Parliament or in politics for a long time engenders a lot of cynicism, which is unhealthy. I wonder if there's any parallels between working in the press gallery. Do you feel that the longer you're there, the more cynical you may become? And if so, how do you try to avoid that happening?
Well, I say to people a lot that I am really the least cynical person I know, and I actually believe that to be true, but it's an active choice you make. You can sink into that sinkhole, you really can, and you need to be the best thing about, or the most essential quality about political reporting is one must be sceptical all the time. It's because people are trying to sell you a bill of goods all the time, just all the time. So one must be sceptical, but if you're cynical, you've kind of lost it. And you know better than some of the protagonists that you're reporting on, and your audience doesn't benefit from your cynicism. The audience does benefit from your scepticism, but not from your cynicism. So you've got to take whatever steps you can take in order to not be cynical, and sometimes it means just finding. I find when I'm hitting particularly nihilistic territory, which I have been lately, I must confess it is very, very hard to look at it lately and find anything positive to say. It really is very difficult. So I find when I hit moments like that, what I do is step back and change my point of view and look for something inside the process that is working still, or find a group of people who are in politics for the right reason and try and tell their story, which is not really being told in the kind of great big narration of dysfunction. So that's sort of what I try to do to avoid cynicism, because most people in politics, like I said at the start, I don't think people went to bed one night, woke up the next morning and thought, how can I be the biggest dickhead on the planet? Like, I really don't think that happened. Yeah. And most people are in the game for the right reasons, and we need to try and support their enterprise and tell their stories, and because just so that all of us maintain some sort of a faith in the system, and perhaps get energised by sort of more modest acts of activism within a political structure.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's take a few steps back then. We've heard in brief your poetry ambitions when you were younger.
Oh, yeah.
How did you come to start writing about politics, Katharine?
Oh, well, in my childhood, my mother, who was a sort of Fraserite liberal, nonetheless had a fiery passion for Alan Ramsay, the Sydney Morning Herald columnist. And my mum, from a very early age, would most Saturdays put me on the back porch in front of Alan Ramsay's column and insist that I read it top to toe. And we sort of had conversations around the dinner table about politics from quite an early age, and obviously I grew up in the 80s, so that was sort of my teen years and the years in your life where if you're a political person you're going to start to get activated, obviously, in your teens. And so that was a great period in Australian political history where the most amazing things were happening. Obviously, the economy was being transformed before our eyes. There was this kind of amazing long period of largely stable government in Canberra. The whole kind of modern Australian identity was starting to assert itself. So I was just intrinsically interested in that. And even though and there was just a lot of encouragement in my family to be interested in it and be interested in ideas and to set your horizon beyond where we were immediately living. So I was kind of always interested in politics, and I was always interested in writing. I was one of those dreadful, dreadful kids who always kept a diary, who had the most sort of florid, horrendous stories in the diary, who was always writing, who sort of was always looking for means of creative expression. And, I did my work experience when I was a kid on the local papers and all of that sort of stuff. But I sort of had this kind of... It was more a kind of unfocused creative impulse than me thinking I want to be, Bob Woodward or something. I didn't think that when I was 12. I just wanted to express myself in ways that I thought were interesting. And so I always thought in the back of my mind it'd be great if you could somehow be a political journalist in Canberra, but I didn't know really how one did that. So I sort of went to university, I did an arts degree, I studied politics, I studied literature, I studied drama, and then I came to Canberra in 1991 because it was the recession and the only people giving anybody a job was the public service, so I came here. And then when I came into the public service here, I met a bunch of gallery journos just because of the sort of work I was doing in the public service and people on the Hill. and met Tom Burton at the Australian Financial Review, who was my first bureau chief, and he said, you're a bit weird, I like you, come on up. So it kind of all fell into place for me, but I was just bloody lucky, really, because I was quite clueless. So I was really lucky that it all just sort of happened for me.
What did he see in you? Have you spoken about this subsequently?
God knows. I don't know, really. I think it was sort of one of those. Tom was very much. I was on a women's panel yesterday for the Canberra Writers Festival, which was enormously good fun with Kathy Lett and Sarah Ferguson and Virginia Hausiger and Sarah said at one point there was this sort of great bunch of men who came through in the 70s and the 80s who were inspired or who embraced feminism and who were liberal and tolerant and had that sort of view of the world. And Tom was absolutely the epitome of that sort of thing. And Tom had been a public servant himself prior to being a journalist, so he thought that was a valid pathway, that you were actually valuable if you'd been inside the beast in some shape or form to report on the goings-on. And Tom sort of thought knowledge first, tradecraft second. So we can train you to do journalism. The knowledge is what is valuable. And I think it's just, I worked for a woman called Janet Willis, who was Bob Hawke's principal private secretary and had worked for Graham Richardson as his chief of staff and was known to Tom. And people who knew Tom thought I was good. So they said to Tom, take a bet on this woman, I reckon she'll be all right.
And what were your early rounds or duties?
Oh, yes, I had rounds at the Fin. Yes, I certainly did. Industrial relations was the key round I had in those days, although I had about 5 or 6. And I arrived in 96. I had 2 weeks of the Keating government before he called the election, and then we went into the 96 election campaign, and then John Howard arrived. And of course, he cracked on with industrial relations very early in the piece and changed the whole workplace relations architecture. And that was very helpful to me because I had worked in DIR and I knew a lot of people in DIR and I knew a lot of people in that neck of the woods. So I had quite a lot of knowledge. I was a completely hopeless journalist. It was dreadful. But in terms of tradecraft, but I knew the area. I knew people who I could go to for background information, and that was enormously helpful to me in that reporting period. So, and sort of smoothed the transition, and I got a lot of help basically to present myself to the world as a journalist. So I did that for a while, and various other microeconomic reform things, very chunky Fin Review type territory, competition law and all this sort of stuff I did. And rose up and did sort of a junior political reporting role. And I also ran that office in Canberra, even though I was sort of, God knows why they got me to do that, but anyway, they did. And then I went from there to the Australian because I needed a change, and I worked there for a couple of years, and then Grattan rang and said, come back to The Age. So I came back to The Age and worked with her, and then I washed up with The Guardian when we launched in Australia.
Yes, you've had an interesting transition between Fairfax and News and now The Guardian. Have you noticed differences or similarities between each of those media organisations?
Oh, they're all different. Yeah, they've all got different cultures and different sort of obsessions, preoccupations, things that are important to them. Everywhere is a different culture. Everywhere you take time to develop fluency in the culture as well as fluency in what you're doing. They're all different. I suppose there's a certain similarity between the Fairfax culture and the Guardian culture, but again, it's a bit different. And News is its very own thing.
Does the culture of a place affect how you report, or the way in which even politicians react to you, knowing which publication you write for? Yeah, I think those things are important. Certainly, the politicians have publications they're more focused on. That's for sure. Does it affect how you report? No, it doesn't. It hasn't affected how I report. I'm kind of tough to budge. I'm not very malleable, but it's more a hierarchy of issues and interests. That some stories are
Like there's a bunch of stuff I did at the Fin Review that no other publication would be interested in, for example. Stuff I routinely got off the front page of the Fin Review that no one else would even think was a story. The Oz, is kind of very, very preoccupied with culture war type stuff. Then Fairfax, it's kind of, you're back in more kind of small L liberal territory. So it influences, it's not so much you changing. I don't think that happens. Maybe it does for some people, but didn't for me because I'm stubborn and pain in the neck. But it does, what you're interested in does change. Like obviously at The Guardian, we are very, very interested in the environment. We are very, very interested in the fate of people less well off than ourselves. We are very, very interested in whether the people we are currently detaining indefinitely in offshore detention are living or dying under our care. So we have a bunch of issues that we prosecute aggressively because we care about those issues. So it's more. I hope I'm being clear. It's sort of more. It's more a focus on particular issues than you becoming a different sort of commentator or having a different voice or having different standards or different objectives.
You've worked for many editors in your time.
I have.
And you are now a political editor at Guardian Australia. I'm wondering if you can put your finger on what makes a good editor.
Oh, God, what a good question. What makes a good editor? I think editors that are reassuring to journalists are editors who stand in the troops, stand in the trench with the troops, and are completely part of the journalistic mission. Editors who have a sense of, in whatever modest way we can, trying to make the world a better place. Those editors are just intrinsically reassuring to journalists. And I've worked with several people who I would put in that category. Also, just the step down from the sort of prime leadership role, what is enormously helpful to journalists are a strong desk, a strong backbench, what we call in the trade. So that's people news editors who are great with headlines, who are great with quick copy interventions if you haven't quite nailed it, who value add the whole business of what you're doing. And I've, again, been extremely fortunate to work with some absolutely brilliant backbench operators. And it's sort of sad in journalism because they are not much remarked upon or lauded. But people like Patrick Smithers, who was a long-time night editor for The Age in Melbourne, is one of the most brilliant backbench operators I've ever had the pleasure of working with. That guy was unflappable under pressure, would pull back, would do drop-ins as we were literally going to press at Tullamarine and not bat an eyelid, had a genius for a headline, and maintained his sense of humour in all kinds of absolutely incredibly stressful situations. And Patrick and I had a funny relationship. I'll just dwell on him slightly because he's a standout character for lots of ways. Because Patrick had a sport background, I think, at The Age, and was a very, very knockabout kind of consumer-focused guy, not that interested in politics, if truth be told, but knew that important things were happening in Canberra and trusted us to narrate them well. And he would regularly do things to me like ring me up and say, mate, which was his sort of opening gambit on the phone. Mate, this is the most boring story you have ever filed. It is so boring, I'm going to put it on one. He'd say stuff like that. Or at 11 o'clock at night, I remember Patrick ringing me once saying, mate, I've got a hole on page 22. Can you belt me out 4 pars? Like just jokes, just stupid stuff like that. And that, sometimes you want to kill him, obviously, but people like that are people who make journalism into something worth consuming. and they are just phenomenal at their jobs. So Patrick's a standout. My first news editor at the Fin Review, Pam Lawkley, another standout. Great editors I've worked for, Colleen Ryan at the Australian Financial Review, who's as tough a woman as you could possibly come across, is fantastic. And obviously it would be highly remiss of me not to mention my very good friend Lenore Taylor, who is currently the editor of Guardian Australia too, and who's doing a fantastic job and learning right in front of us how to be a fantastic, brilliant editor in about 5 whole seconds.
That idea of a good editor being in the trenches with the troops, do you try to bring that to your own role as political editor?
Yeah, I do.
Do you succeed, do you think?
Well, you'd have to ask my colleagues whether or not I succeed on that. I'm very much in the muck with them, and very hands-on, and with the 2 young men in my office, part mother, part footy coach, part don't know what I am really. But anyway, they would give a more kind of full account, I think, of what they think about me as a leader. But no, I've worked for a lot of political editors in my time, obviously, and all of them have different styles. Some are entirely hands-off, some are entirely hands-on. I've always benefited from people who have been hands-on and who have worked with me intensively at times when I've needed it. And so, again, my first boss, Tom Burton, in the Fin Review, when I was pathetically grateful to him for saving me from embarrassing myself in the Fin Review, on one occasion just said to me, look, it's karma, mate. You don't need to thank me, just give it back in the future. And so that's what I try and do. You'd have to ask other people whether I succeed, I don't know.
What about making mistakes in stories, small or big? Anything come to mind in your career that might have seemed catastrophic at the time and has since proved not to be?
Oh, God. Well, everyone makes mistakes. Obviously, anyone who says they don't make mistakes is a liar. It's just you need to obviously correct those mistakes quickly and honestly and transparently and move on. I haven't made sort of a terrible error. One thing that was just terribly embarrassing when I was at the Fin Review and when I was doing the IR round was we used to publish a story about this data series called Waterline, which was about waterfront productivity. And for some reason, the first... so after the waterfront dispute, after that big dispute, all the reporters were very interested in what the waterline data would do, right? Would things get more productive on the waterfront? Would it happen quickly? And so I sort of went boots and all into the first stats after the waterfront dispute, the waterline dispute, and they'd gone backwards. And I thought, oh, God, rip snorter of a story. Page 1, here we come, boom. And then realised to my horror the next day that I had picked up the wrong tab on the stats and had actually written the March stats from the year before. And this had gotten off the front page of the Fin. I think Mark, my husband, just died over there because he's remembering that incident. And so nothing you can do. It's just it's a total stuff up, and total mea culpa is all you can do. Terribly sorry. And fortunately, I don't think the actual stats were much better than the ones I'd reported on. But you just have to own it. It's just like, sorry, I am an idiot. I have done the wrong thing here. I am a fool. And I had luckily had reasonable relationships with, various all the protagonists in that dispute who understood it was an honest mistake. And I don't know, could that have been career-ending? I don't know. Maybe if an editor had been very brutal, it might have been, but it wasn't in my case.
What about cultivating sources, working in the press gallery, politicians and those close to them, and building trust? How have you gone about that? Perhaps any tips for younger reporters who might be listening?
Well, I think it's very important to be honest and transparent with people. And not sort of overcomplicate those relationships. It's sort of the best thing you can do is be trusted, so that people know that they can tell you something approximating the truth, and that you'll report it fairly, or on some occasions that you won't report it because you have undertaken not to, but it's important for you nonetheless to have that knowledge. So I think young reporters sometimes overcomplicate things by perhaps, you're new in politics, you want people to like you, you want to sort of form these relationships with people who literally can make or break your career, I suppose. And people overthink it a bit and sort of want to be nice or want to be charming or want to be disarming or want to be... it's just not important. It's sort of like people have to get to know one another on their own terms and reach a point of trust, a basic operating point of trust. And so I think it takes you a while to learn that. And it also takes you... The best thing about being a long-term political reporter in Canberra is that what you learn if you stick at this for, in my case, 21 years, you learn not to be afraid. That you're dealing with very powerful people. You're dealing with the most powerful people in the country. That can be, when you first enter the field, quite intimidating. But the longer you do this, you learn that you will probably outlast everybody who is sitting before you in the parliament and all of their staff and all of their underlings. You will still be there. So I think Laura Tingle said that to Scott Morrison in the press club in some light exchange, I think about 12 months ago, and Morrison kind of looked at her as if to say, what? Like that thought had not occurred to him. It's kind of like, that's what you learn. I know that's a different point to sources, but it's sort of more your operability in the terrain. So I think the longer you do it, the less afraid you get, and the less afraid you are, the more honest you will be as a reporter. And so that's the benefit of longevity in Canberra. I'm sure the public must look at the cadre of political reporters who have been around forever and say, oh my God, can't someone else just have a go? I'm sick of reading that person. I mean, I'm sick of the sound of my own voice. It's like, holy God, what, another column? Are you kidding? So I totally get that. But it's like, all I can say to people is that it's an investment. It is genuinely an investment, because the bunch of people who have been there for a long time, to a man and a woman, are not afraid, and that benefits you.
I'm not sick of the sound of your voice, Katharine.
That's very kind.
Live blogging has been a big part of your career. I think towards the end of your time at The Age, you started it there and then brought it across to Guardian Australia. What are the mechanics and the things you've learned about how to run a live blog successfully? Yeah,
well, that's a whole different ballgame. And it was a form I was very, very keen to establish in the Australian journalistic scene, because it was a form that The Guardian, under this phenomenal guy who's still doing it by the name of Andy Sparrow, was doing to great effect in the UK. And I myself was a great reader of live political blogs, and just found them enormously helpful, just sources of news. If big events are going on in the UK, I would tune in immediately to Andy, and bang, there it would all be. It was just fantastic. So I thought in the Australian context we really needed to be in that territory, particularly when we crossed over from the newspaper era to the digital one. And I saw digital myself as a kind of, it was intuition, and it's now proved the actual foundation of everybody's business model. But digital for me was a very much community-based journalism. It was sort of like you can thrust yourself, it's immediate, it's present, you're thrust into the middle of a live interactive community who are talking to you and who are interacting with you, and you are bringing them information as it happens. And I thought, look, we're going to do more and more live stuff. That's just what the technology is driving us to do. We have to occupy this space, and we have to learn to do it well. We have to learn how to apply a quality metric in the live space. And that's quite hard to do, and I'm not saying I did it perfectly, not at all, but that was my objective and intention, was to occupy the live space and to try and do it well, and to try and inject some quality and some density into that reporting. So, but it's a very different style of reporting, and it changes your brain. it actually changes the way your brain functions. It's quite weird, and changes the way you process information. And so it's sort of it's quite a thing. Live blogging, it retools you as a journalist in all kinds of ways, and you come out the other side like you've had the most massive grease and oil change you've ever had in your life. But anyway, it's an important form. It's proved an enduring form. Now everyone's doing it, so that's great. They're great tools for readers. At Guardian Australia, Politics Live has a massive audience every day we do it. It's pretty much the biggest thing we do.
You wrote about live blogging in an essay for Meanjin in 2013 called Disconnected Life, yes. And you wrote that bathroom and coffee logistics became a significant preoccupation on a live blogging day.
Yeah, it is. When you've got a file every 10 minutes, the most stressful thing that happens to you is, can I get to the bathroom? Like you become morbidly obsessed with, can I get to the bathroom? Particularly on a busy day. And I know that sounds insane, but it's like if a live blog has a heartbeat, it has a consistent pulse, and the information needs to go out, and some people, bless them, are hanging on it. They're hanging on what happens next. And, you know, going to the bathroom seems a luxury you can't afford. So without getting into sort of horrifying personal territory, I was very grateful, actually, when I moved from the Fairfax Bureau, which was a fair distance from the bathrooms, to the Guardian Australia Bureau, which was right across the road from the bathroom. I thought, happy times. Like, whoa, my quality of life has improved immeasurably, because that bathroom is like way in sprinting distance. So, yeah, it's sort of like, they're a big commitment. You know, live blog days, you can do a 10-hour live blog day, and they're physically punishing, they're mentally punishing, and you do get reduced to this very basic human preoccupations, like, have I had a drink of water today, and can I go to the bathroom?
In that same essay, published in 2013, you also reflected on the 24/7 media cycle and the advent of having smartphones in our hands as reporters and as politicians who are constantly having to react to what is being reported. You wrote at the time, it's happened very fast and I sense there's no going back. Yeah. That was 4 years ago. Yeah. What have you observed since then?
There's no going back. There's no going back. Well, this is the thing. I sort of thought, in a way, funnily, when journalism's gone through this major technological disruption in my reporting lifetime, the first 10 years I was a newspaper person, the next 10 years I was a digital person, and that's just because of the intrusion of the internet. And once the internet's in the mix, that's what creates 24/7 news and the live channels. Because once upon a time we could only talk to you once a day as print journalists. Now we can talk to you every 5 minutes if we want to. And journalists and audiences, for whatever reason, have really flocked to the live materials. So there it is. I knew from the minute the technology hit, this is where we were going. You have to try and make peace with it. And there was a bit of a Luddite machine-breaking phase in journalism, with people really resisting live and thinking that this was the end of the world for us. But I was not one of those people. I kind of ran into the machine gun fire, arms kind of flayed, and just I was out there. I was going to do it. I think when I wrote that first essay at the end of the first live blogging year, I was more optimistic then than I am now. I think I was more inclined to think that the transformative effect of technology would deliver really, really considerable upside to journalism and our practice. And I think digital has delivered upside. I quite like digital myself. I like it at a number of levels. And it's good for audiences in many ways. But you've got to think about this. I said this at a forum recently, and I hope this analogy kind of makes sense. Like, what's happened to journalists is the equivalent of, let's just think about yourselves as car makers working in a car factory and assembling a car, right? You go into work one day and you assemble the car in the way that you've done it for the last 20 years, right? Then overnight, no one asking you whether this is okay or not, no one having a seminar about it, no one saying, oh guys, there's something just on the horizon here, nothing, no warning. You go into work the next day, someone's taken out all the old machines and they've put brand new machines in front of you that fundamentally changes the nature of your work. And not only are you reassembling the car with new machines, new technology that you've never sighted before, the added complication of that is what digital has thrust on journalism, is that there is a requirement to do it in front of a live audience, right? So there's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to go over into the corner and just have a little practice and see if you can tune it up right and everything will be okay. We've had no privacy to make this transition. We've had to do it in full public view, basically. So you can imagine, if that happens, if the technological disruption is that profound from one day to the next, there's going to be some problems. We're not going to do it brilliantly from the first shift in the technology. We're not, because we're making it up. We've never done it before. We're learning how to do things in a fundamentally different way, and we're doing it right in front of you. So we're going to be fiddling with these knobs for years to come, and you're going to be watching us do it. And the added complication of doing it in the digital era is because, of course, all the media's business models have been profoundly affected by this technological disruption. There are fewer of us doing more. That's the practical. That's what happened. And being called upon to innovate all the time and push the craft out in new and different ways. So again, I'm not saying this again to, rather like the politicians, to convene a pity party for journalism. We have great jobs. We have the best jobs ever. That's why we do it. And that's why we cling on to this very, very difficult and demanding career, because, you know, it's great. It's fantastic. It's a privilege. But we are going through really profound things, and we are going through them in front of you, and sometimes we will not do it well. And, you know, that's sort of, in summary, the transition I've been through in the last 10 years, and exemplifying in the live form. So what the 24/7 news channels do, what you do on a live blog, how that then disrupts and changes the news cycle, because the 24/7 news cycle, the currency of the news cycle is the new. What has happened that is new, right? In the old newspaper news cycle, the currency was, is this important? Is this important enough to sit on a shelf for 12 hours and you learn about it 12 hours later? Is it that important, right? The currency was not new. In the live cycle, the currency is new. And that's why you get new at you all the time. Whereas before there was an inbuilt rationing system. So you got important. You didn't get new. So the art of live, for those of us who practice it and who care deeply about our profession and who don't want to fail our audiences, what we're trying to do in this mode is give you new, important quality. And that's a very, very, very tough benchmark to set yourself. And you would be a very arrogant person if I sat up here and said, I do that every time, because I sure don't. And none of us do. But we do our best. But it's very, very hard. And in 2013, I was much more Pollyanna-ish about it than I am now.
Well, at that time, you wrote in that essay, the journalism I now practice during the peak political season requires me to be an air traffic controller. Yeah. And I think I got a glimpse of that earlier this week when we spoke on the phone, and you said, I've got about 3 or 4 things coming down the runway right now. I can't really talk right now.
God, poor Andrew, it was dreadful.
I wonder how good you are at shutting down those controls and walking away. Has switching off become easier or harder for you?
Easier. Oh, yeah. Like I'm in my life, I am totally on and I'm totally off, and it's the only way to survive. If you sort of try to maintain your kind of incoming at the pace I have to work at and process information, if you did that literally every hour of your day, 7 days a week, I would be in an asylum by now. I kid you not. You cannot function at that degree of hyper thrust. I don't know. Maybe a very extroverted, an enormously extroverted person who needs that stimulation maybe could function at that work rate. But I find I need periods, and I'm much more aggressive about it than I used to be, of just shutting down. Just like, I don't want to hear about anything any politician said for 12 hours. That's it. total blank. Don't watch the news, don't read newspapers, don't engage in any shape or form. I find I have to do that in order to recuperate.
As a kind of self-protective measure.
Yeah, otherwise I burn out.
The last thing I want to ask you about is another of your meandering essays this one was published in summer 2016. It's called The Heir Apparent, and it's quite different to all of your others, which concern either politics or journalism. Talk a little about where that idea for that rather personal essay came from.
Well, this is an essay I wrote about my 17-year-old daughter leaving home and going off to live an independent life as a student in Sydney, which is what she's done in the last 12 months. And it was a sort of, I don't know, just so that the listeners to Andrew's podcast know, we do have some people in the audience here who are listening in who I'm sort of semi-addressing in this conversation. I'm sure there'll be people out in the audience who have been through this experience with your own kids, that they reach that point where they're departing for their own life, and you have that moment of consciousness as a parent that, oh my God, like, how did that happen? How do we get to that moment where they're going and they're on their way? And that hit me very hard. I have to be frank, it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I felt as though I needed to put some structure around it in a writerly sense, because that's how I cope with pretty much everything, and that's how I've coped my entire life with pretty much anything, is writing about it, writing about chaos of any type, emotional, professional, whatever else. So I wrote this piece, which was a sort of a kind of distilling of the relationship I'd had with my daughter at various moments. And I'm a bit emotional talking about it. It's not, I don't tend to write a lot of personal stuff. It's not, people don't need you don't need your personal story thrust on them, but that was just a process I had to go through. So it's a bit of a sort of it's a lyrical piece. It's a piece that's structured at different stages of our life together, and it sort of celebrates her independence and my sort of very kind of curmudgeonly attitude to it. And it was good for both of us. My daughter and I both felt good about that piece, and it was a nice farewell. And again, lots of people tended or seemed to relate to it, because obviously it's a universal story. So, and it's just doing something a little bit different. But it was, it's territory I'm not normally in. Don't intend to do a lot of it, but it was just something I felt I had to get off my chest.
Yeah, you write very movingly of bath time with her as a newborn, and then as she became employed, she works at a hair salon, and now every Saturday, maybe even today, I don't know, she washes your hair.
She does. That's the weird thing, to go from a situation where you've got this little tiny girl who you're washing her hair and washing her through her life and all of this sort of stuff, and then all of a sudden this role reversal happens where you're in a hairdressing salon and she's washing my hair. Mm-hmm. And I sort of projected forward horribly into the sort of my creeping infirmity. So it's sort of, it's a kind of cycle of life piece, and just sort of taking, it's how I tend to respond to things that are hard to process in whatever way. I tend to just grab onto moments that exist and try and put them together in a way that makes sense, and it's kind of a psychic salve apart from anything else.
It's a wonderful piece. I highly recommend it, The Heir Apparent. This is my last question for you, Katharine. At what point did you show your daughter that piece?
Oh, yes. Well, I asked her, before I wrote it, I asked her permission to do it, because in my house we're very church and state, and it's quite a big thing to do, obviously, and it's the thing that I imagine writers of fiction and other types of writing struggle with, that you obviously have permission to narrate your own experience in your own life, but you don't really have permission to go and pillage somebody else's life and represent that on the page. And writers like Helen Garner talk very intelligently about those conundrums and conflicts that people have. And obviously, I've got an 18-year-old daughter who deserves to define her own life and not be narrated by her mother. So I asked her in advance, would you mind if I wrote something about this? And she looked a bit trepidatious and said, let's see how we go with that. And so then I wrote it and I gave it to her sort of full of anxiety, partly because I talked Jonathan Green into publishing this thing that wasn't politics. And I thought, God, if she vetoes it, I'm in all kinds of strife here. I'm going to have to produce something else in about 5 whole minutes. So I took it rather nervously into the bedroom and handed it to her, and she shut the door. And I thought, okay, righto. So, busy work, please don't veto it.
Don't have your ear to the door.
Exactly.
Seeing if you can hear
Don't panic, it's all fine. I'm just down here polishing the clothes line because it needs a polish. So we sort of had that rather awkward period in the house where she was reading and processing it. And then she came out and said, Mum, this is amazing. You got to do it. So I was given permission to do it. And she's quite sort of proud of the piece, I think, in a funny sort of way. And she was she had the experience of actually being at a social gathering and hearing a conversation about between adults who were talking about the piece. Strangely, some party in Canberra, these 2 adults were talking to each other about, wow, there was this piece and it was in my engine. It was about this kid and and a mum and. God, I cried, and then I showed it to, my friend and everything else, and Evie's just kind of like, do I say that was me, or what do I say here? Do I just be quiet? Or anyway, so she came home quite delighted and retailed this story to me that, she was the silent figure in the middle of this party, that no one knew she was the silent figure. So anyway, it was fun. I'm not going to do it a lot, but I needed to do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to thank Katharine Murphy.
And thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to Penmanship, and thank you to my guest, Katharine Murphy. You can find show notes to this episode, including links to the essays we discussed, at penmanshippodcast.com. Special thanks to the Canberra Writers Festival for allowing this conversation to happen, and special thanks to Bevan Noble at Be Natural Productions for recording this episode at the festival. If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways you can support it. You can share it with people in your life who love reading and talking about great Australian writing. You can leave a review on your podcast app of choice, or you can share it on social media. You can find the podcast on Facebook and on Twitter under the handle @penmanshipau. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you. Andrew@penmanshippodcast.com is my email. The theme song is Eternally Yours by Laughing Clowns. That's it for now. Until next time.